The day my family buried me, I stood at the back of the church in a suit I had pressed myself that morning. I watched my daughter-in-law dab her eyes with a tissue she had probably practiced with the night before. I watched my son give the eulogy, his voice cracking at all the right moments, and I waited, not because I enjoy theater, but because the papers in my hand needed the right audience. When the service ended and the mourners filed toward the reception hall to eat casserole and trade memories I was supposed to be part of, I straightened my jacket, tucked the documents under my arm, and walked through the side door. I had been dead for 6 months, and everyone who needed to believe that was about to have a very difficult afternoon. The man I was about to confront was my own son. Nathan believed he had buried his father. So did his wife, Claire, who had planned the funeral down to the song selection. So did Claire's father, Gerald, the real architect of what had happened, the man who had convinced them all I was gone. What no one in that room knew was that the death certificate they had filed was built on a lie. The will they had executed was forged. And the inheritance they had already started spending was never theirs to take. I had spent 6 months collecting proof, not just that I was alive, but that the conspiracy to erase me had been documented, step by step, by the people now serving themselves my funeral potatoes. 6 months earlier, I was not a dead man. I was a 67-year-old retired civil engineer named Arthur Vance, and I had spent the morning arguing with a plumber about a water heater. That was the problem with being comfortable, I learned. The leaks still happened. The joints still corroded. Life does not stop sending you maintenance issues just because your portfolio passed a number your father could not have imagined. My father worked in a textile mill in South Carolina for 41 years. He left my mother a small house, a pension that barely covered her prescriptions, and a lesson I carried longer than I realized. Never let them know what you have, so I did not. When I sold my engineering firm in 2016 for just over $11 million, I told no one outside my accountant and my attorney, not my golf partners, not my neighbors, not my son Nathan. I told him I was retiring, that we had done well enough, and that I would be comfortable. He asked a few polite questions and then asked if I could help with the down payment on a house. I wrote him a check for $50,000. He and his wife Claire bought a 4-bedroom colonial in a development where the trees were still saplings and the mailboxes all matched. I came to the housewarming. I brought a bottle of wine and a card. I was the simple retired father, proud of his boy, asking for nothing. What I did not say was that the check I wrote represented less than half of 1% of what I was worth. And I did not say that because I believed 2 things at the same time. 1, that my son deserved to build something himself. And 2, that Claire looked at my car the way an appraiser looks at a piece of furniture. Claire came from money that had not been earned so much as arranged. Her father, Gerald, was a commercial developer who specialized in what he called distressed property acquisition. What he meant was purchasing buildings from people who had run out of time, then turning them into luxury condos for people who hadn't. Gerald drove a car that cost more than most people's houses, and he talked about real estate the way other men talk about weather. Inevitably, always, with the faint suggestion that he knew something you did not. The first Christmas after Nathan and Claire married, Gerald cornered me after dinner and asked what I thought about the market. I said I was glad I wasn't in it. He laughed and said that was the smartest answer he had heard all night. He patted me on the shoulder and walked away. I watched him go and made a mental note. That was the moment Gerald decided I was no threat to whatever he was planning, and that was the first small piece of evidence I would later need. The next 2 years were quiet. Nathan worked for a construction firm in town. Claire managed a small interior design business that Gerald had funded. They came for holidays. They sent texts on my birthday. I lived in a modest house on a half-acre lot with a garage full of tools I actually used. I drove a 7-year-old sedan. I wore a Timex watch. I looked, to anyone paying attention, like a retiree living within his means, because I was. The means were simply larger than anyone had bothered to investigate. In the summer of last year, I turned 66. Nathan and Claire took me to dinner at a steakhouse downtown. Gerald and his wife joined us. It was a pleasant evening, full of talk about Claire's new project and Gerald's latest acquisition, an old shopping center he was trying to rezone. At some point, the conversation turned to estate planning. I said I had a will drawn up years ago. Gerald asked who was handling it. I gave him the name of my attorney, a local man named Stephen. Gerald nodded and said he had heard of him. He said it casually, the way you might comment on the weather again. I did not think about it much at the time. I have spent many hours thinking about it since. 3 weeks after that dinner, my attorney Stephen called me. He said someone had contacted his office under the pretense of a routine document review, asking for a copy of my will. The request had been submitted on letterhead from a firm Gerald had worked with. Stephen said he had denied it naturally, but he wanted me to know. I thanked him and hung up. I sat in my kitchen for a long time. That was the moment I understood I was no longer a father-in-law. I was a problem to be solved. I did not confront anyone. I did not call Nathan. I have worked contracts for 35 years, and I know that the first person to show their position is the first person to lose. So I waited. I hired a private investigator named Marcus, a retired state police detective who specialized in financial fraud. I told him I wanted to know if anyone was looking into my assets, my property, my history. I told him I wanted a full report, as discreet as possible. He nodded and said he would need 3 weeks. He came back in 2. Marcus sat across from me at the same kitchen table where I had sat after Stephen's call and laid out a folder. Gerald had been busy. He had run title searches on 3 properties I owned under trust. He had pulled my tax records through a contact at the county assessor's office. He had compiled a dossier on my net worth that was accurate within a margin of error small enough to impress me if I hadn't been so disturbed. But the most damning document was not about my money. It was about my death. Gerald had drafted a preliminary version of a death certificate, my death certificate. The date of death was left blank. The cause was listed as cardiac arrest. The document was not filed anywhere yet. It was a working draft, Marcus explained, the kind of thing someone creates when they are structuring a timeline and need to see how the pieces fit. Marcus asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I needed to think. What I was actually doing was deciding how far this had already gone and who, specifically, had signed on to it. I called Stephen the next morning and told him everything. He was silent for a moment, then he asked a question I will never forget. He said, "Arthur, do you know if your son is part of this?" I told him I did not know, and that was the worst part of it. I could handle Gerald, I could handle Claire, but I did not know if my own son had looked at a draft of his father's death certificate and said nothing. That question sat inside me like a piece of shrapnel. Every time I thought I had found a comfortable position, it shifted and cut. I decided to find out. I told Stephen to leak a piece of false information. I had an old insurance policy, paid out long ago, but the record still existed. I told him to route the paperwork through a channel Gerald had been monitoring and to flag it in a way that suggested I had recently updated the beneficiary. I waited. 1 week passed, 2. Then Marcus called. Gerald had reacted. He had accelerated something. Nathan called me on a Tuesday. His voice was strange, tight in a way I had not heard since he was a teenager trying to explain a dented fender. He said he and Claire had been talking and they were worried about my health. He asked if I had been to a doctor recently. He said Claire had noticed I looked tired at the last dinner. I told him I was fine. He said they wanted me to see a specialist, a cardiologist Gerald knew, a very good man. He was persistent. He offered to drive me. I told him I would think about it. When I hung up, my hand was shaking. That night I sat in the dark in my living room and made a decision. If they wanted me dead, I would give them a death. But it would be on my terms, with my documentation, with my witnesses, and with a paper trail so complete that no amount of legal maneuvering could unwind it. I called Stephen. I called Marcus. I laid out a plan. Stephen told me it was the most dangerous thing he had ever heard, and also the only way to find out the truth about everyone at once. So we began. I disappeared 8 weeks later. The official story was a heart attack at home, found by Nathan after I missed a lunch. There was a small service, a closed casket. Stephen managed the paperwork with a funeral director who was an old client of his. Marcus made sure the death certificate was filed, the one Gerald had been drafting for months, now filled in with a date and a signature. Everything looked real because most of it was. The only lie was the body in the box. It was not me. It was a medical cadaver, donated with papers that would not hold up under scrutiny, but only needed to hold up long enough for the truth to do its work. I watched from a distance. I rented a small apartment 2 towns over and lived under a name I had used on a few contracts back in the 90s. I let my beard grow. I wore glasses I did not need. I became a man who did not look like the pictures they had of me. And then I waited. I waited for the will to be executed, for the assets to be distributed, for Gerald to make his next move. He made it within 3 weeks of my funeral. He filed papers to consolidate my properties under a new LLC, the same structure he had tried to get me to sign up for while I was alive. Only now it was easier. The dead do not object. But I was not dead, and every document Gerald filed, every signature he forged, every asset he transferred was another piece of evidence in a case that was now, by my count, 8 felonies wide. I had the death certificate draft. I had the forged will. I had the property records. I had a recording of Nathan on the phone asking me to see a cardiologist he had never mentioned before. And I had something else, something I only found after the funeral. A text message from Claire to Gerald, sent 3 days before my supposed death, that read, and I will quote it exactly, "Dad, the timeline is set. Make sure the doctor is ready for the paperwork." The doctor who was supposed to sign my death certificate had a vacation home in Florida. Gerald had paid for it. Marcus found the transfer. I had everything I needed. 6 months of work, $300,000 in investigative expenses, and a rage that had burned down to something cold and patient and ready. Which brings me back to the church. The casserole was getting cold. My son was shaking hands with people who kept telling him what a good man his father had been. Gerald was in the corner, talking to someone from the county recorder's office. Claire was looking at her phone. I adjusted the folder under my arm. I walked toward the reception hall, and I opened the door. 100 faces turned toward me. For 3 full seconds, no one breathed. Then the first glass shattered. Someone near the punch table dropped a tumbler, and the sound cut through the silence like a starting pistol. Voices erupted. A woman I recognized from the neighborhood association backed into the wall. An old colleague from the engineering firm, a man named Dale who had sent a very nice condolence card, went pale as copy paper. But I was not watching them. I was watching my son. Nathan stood near the memorial photograph they had set up, a blown-up picture of me from 3 years ago, the one Linda took at the lake. His hand was still extended from the handshake he had been offering the pastor. His face did the thing I had feared most. It went through shock, yes, but under the shock, there was recognition, not the surprise of a grieving son seeing his dead father, the recognition of a man who had been told the trick was finished and was now realizing the trick had turned. I walked toward him. The crowd parted the way crowds do when they sense something has gone dangerously off script. Someone whispered, "Arthur," and the name moved through the room like a current. I did not stop. I held the folder flat against my ribs, and I walked until I was standing 3 feet from Nathan. He had not moved. His mouth was open slightly. His eyes were wet. I did not know yet what the tears meant. I said, "Hello, son." He tried to speak. The sound that came out was not a word. Behind him, near the corner table where the framed photos were arranged, I saw Claire rise from her chair. Her face was a study in calculation interrupted. She was running through options the same way a chess program runs through moves when you have just placed a piece it did not predict. Her father, Gerald, was standing next to her. He had set down his plate. I raised my voice enough to carry. I said, "I apologize for the interruption. I know you all came to pay your respects, but there has been a misunderstanding. I am not dead, and I have the documentation to prove it." The room went silent again. Then Gerald stepped forward. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had built a career on turning liability into leverage. He said, "Arthur, this is not funny. If this is some kind of prank, it's in very poor taste. We have a death certificate. We have a funeral. We buried you." I looked at him. I said, "You buried a medical cadaver, Gerald, purchased through a shell company you directed, with a paper trail that leads directly to your development firm's discretionary account. I have the invoice. I have the wire transfer confirmation. I have the donor documentation that proves the body in that casket was a 72-year-old man who died of liver failure in a county hospital 2 states away and was donated to science before you rerouted him into your stage production." Gerald's smile did not disappear. It hardened. That was how I knew he understood exactly what I was saying. A man who is innocent does not react to a threat with tactical silence. He reacts with confusion. Gerald was not confused. He was calculating. Claire stepped forward. She put her hand on Nathan's arm. She said, "Arthur, if you faked your own death, that's a crime. You understand that, right? You could go to prison for this." I looked at her for a moment, then I opened the folder. I pulled out the top document, a copy of the draft death certificate Marcus had found, the one Gerald had prepared months before I went into hiding. I held it up so the room could see. I said, "This is a draft of a death certificate for one Arthur Vance. It was created 8 weeks before my supposed heart attack. It lists the cause of death as cardiac arrest. It lists the certifying physician as a doctor named Lawrence Hemphill. Dr. Hemphill, as several of you may know, has a vacation home in the Florida Keys. He bought it for cash in April of this year. The funds trace back to a limited partnership controlled by Gerald Townsend. I have those records too." A murmur moved through the room. Gerald's smile was gone now. He said nothing. I continued. "Dr. Hemphill has since been contacted by state investigators. He has provided a sworn statement that he was approached by Gerald Townsend to sign a death certificate for a patient he had never examined as a conditional precondition of a business loan he was trying to secure. The loan was the mortgage on that vacation home. The condition was his signature on my cause of death. I have the statement here, notarized and witnessed." I pulled out the next document. I set it on the table next to the memorial photograph. Then I pulled out the forged will, the one that had been filed in probate court 3 days after my funeral. I said, "This is the will that was submitted to the county. It names Nathan as sole executor and beneficiary. It transfers all assets into a newly formed LLC, the same structure Gerald tried to get me to sign when I was alive. The signatures on this document include my name, supposedly witnessed by 2 individuals. Both witnesses have been interviewed. Both say they never saw me sign anything. Both say they were paid $500 each by a man matching Gerald's description to sign as witnesses without reading the document. Their statements are in this folder." I looked at Nathan. He had not moved. His face was gray. He said, "Dad, I didn't know." I said, "I want to believe that, Nathan. I have wanted to believe that for 6 months, but I have one more document, and I need you to help me understand it." I pulled out a printed screenshot of a text message, Claire's phone 3 days before my disappearance, the one that read, "Dad, the timeline is set. Make sure the doctor is ready for the paperwork." I set it on the table next to the forged will. Claire's hand tightened on Nathan's arm. She said, "That's taken out of context." I said, "Then provide the context, Claire. Because in any context I can imagine, a woman does not tell her father to prepare a doctor for paperwork 3 days before her father-in-law's supposed fatal heart attack, unless she knows the heart attack is coming." The room was not murmuring now. It was completely still. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights in the church basement. You could hear someone's phone vibrating against a table. Gerald took a step forward. He was not smiling. He was not calculating. He was angry. The anger of a man who had never been confronted with evidence he could not spin. He said, "Arthur, you've constructed a very elaborate conspiracy theory, but I have lawyers. I have resources. You have a folder full of accusations and a fake death you orchestrated yourself. Who do you think the authorities are going to believe?" I had been waiting for that question, because the answer was the reason I had let the funeral happen. I had staged the confrontation to occur in front of witnesses, 63 of them, by the sign-in sheet at the door. I had chosen the reception hall because it was a public enough setting that no one could claim it was a private dispute, and I had invited one particular guest specifically for this moment. The side door of the reception hall opened. 2 men in plain clothes walked in. One was a county prosecutor I had known for 20 years. The other was a state police detective I had hired as a consultant through Marcus's firm. I had not told them every detail ahead of time. I had told them enough. They had been waiting in the parking lot, watching from a window, listening on a feed. They had heard everything. The prosecutor walked up to Gerald. He said, "Mr. Townsend, I'm going to need you to come with us. We have some questions about a fraudulent death certificate filed in this county." Gerald looked at the detective, then he looked at me, then he laughed. It was a short, ugly laugh. He said, "You think this is over? You think you've won something here? Arthur, you have no idea what you've set in motion." I said, "Then explain it to me, Gerald." He did not answer. The detective took his arm. Another officer had appeared and was moving toward Claire. But then the room broke open in a way I did not expect. Nathan spoke. His voice was raw. He said, "Dad, wait. There's something you need to hear before this goes any further, something Claire told me last night." Claire's face went white. She said, "Nathan, don't." Nathan looked at her. The look on his face was not anger, it was worse. It was the look of a man who had been living with a secret and was finally letting it breathe. He said, "She told me you weren't supposed to be in the casket anyway. She said the plan was never about the inheritance. She said it was about something bigger. She said there was money I didn't know about, not your money, someone else's money, and they needed you dead to get it." The room tilted. I looked at Claire. She was not calculating anymore. She was terrified. And I realized in that moment that the conspiracy I had uncovered was only the surface of something else. The will, the death certificate, the forged documents, all of it was a tool. The real target was not my estate. The real target was something buried so deep that even my 6-month investigation had missed it. I turned to the prosecutor. I said, "We're not done here." And then Gerald laughed again. This time it was not ugly, it was satisfied. He said, "Ask him about the engineering firm, Arthur. Ask him about the merger in 2016. Ask him who the buyer really was." I did not know what he meant, but the way Nathan's face changed, I knew I was about to find out. And whatever it was worse than anything I had already proven. Gerald's laugh was still hanging in the air when Nathan collapsed into a folding chair and put his head in his hands. The detective was leading Gerald toward the side exit. Claire was standing rigid near the photo table, an officer positioned beside her. The guests were being ushered out by the pastor, who looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. I did not move. I stood over my son, the folder still in my hand, and I waited. When Nathan looked up, his eyes were red but dry. He said, "Dad, I swear I didn't know about the death certificate. I didn't know about the will. But Claire told me something last night that I should have told you the second you walked in that door." He paused. His voice cracked. "She said the reason Gerald needed you gone wasn't your money, it was the insurance money." I asked him what insurance money he was talking about. I have held life insurance policies before, standard ones, enough to cover funeral costs and leave a small buffer. Nothing worth orchestrating a fake death over. Nathan shook his head. He said, "Not your personal policy, the one attached to the sale of your firm." I had not thought about the sale documents in years. When I sold Vance Engineering in 2016, the deal was straightforward. A mid-sized infrastructure firm based in Atlanta had acquired us for a mix of cash and earn-out provisions. My attorney Stephen had reviewed everything. I had signed dozens of pages, standard boilerplate, the usual warranties and indemnifications. Buried in the closing documents was a key person life insurance policy. The acquiring company had insisted on it, standard practice for a founder whose expertise was central to the transition. The policy paid out to the company upon my death. The beneficiary was listed as a holding entity I barely remembered. I called Stephen from the church kitchen. I told him to pull the sale file immediately and find the insurance rider. He called back in 20 minutes. His voice was different, quiet in a way that meant he had found something he wished he hadn't. He said, "Arthur, the beneficiary on the key person policy is not the acquiring company. It's a separate limited partnership called Atlantica Growth Holdings. I just ran the corporate registry. The managing member of that partnership is Gerald Townsend." The policy amount was $12 million. I stood in the church kitchen with the smell of old coffee and the distant murmur of the last mourners being guided out, and I understood what Gerald had been chasing. My personal estate, the properties, the trusts, the rental units, they were worth just under $2.5 million, enough to ruin a family over, enough to forge documents and bribe witnesses. But the insurance policy was 5 times that, $12 million, payable on the death of one man. A man who had signed the document himself without ever noticing the beneficiary structure, because Gerald had made sure he wouldn't. Stephen walked me through the trail. In 2016, Gerald's development firm had been quietly acquiring stakes in small engineering companies across the Southeast. He was not interested in the engineering work. He was interested in the insurance portfolios attached to their founders. The scheme was elegant in its ugliness. Gerald would identify firms with agging founders who had not yet passed control to the next generation. He would structure an acquisition through layers of shell companies, insert himself as the beneficiary on a large key person policy, and then wait. In most cases, he simply waited for the founder to die naturally. The policies were structured so the company paid the premiums, not Gerald, so his cost was zero. The payout would go to Atlantica Growth Holdings, which he controlled. The acquiring company, often undercapitalized and dependent on Gerald's financing, would see only a fraction of the benefit. It was predatory, cynical, and fully legal, as long as the founder died naturally. But I had not died naturally. I was 67 and in excellent health. Gerald had been waiting for nearly a decade. As the policy's term approached its expiration date, he faced a problem. If I remained alive past the policy's coverage window, he would get nothing, so he decided to help nature along. The medical examiner's report that had been filed with my death certificate listed the certifying physician as Dr. Lawrence Hemphill. Hemphill, as I had already established, was bought and paid for, but what I had not yet uncovered was how deep the false medical trail went. Marcus had continued working while I was in hiding. His full report, which I had not read in its entirety before the funeral, contained a section I had skimmed past. In the 2 months before my supposed death, Gerald had arranged 3 fake medical appointments for me, appointments I had never attended, appointments where records were fabricated showing declining cardiac health, elevated blood pressure, a stress test result that suggested imminent failure. The records were placed in a file at a clinic where Hemphill had admitting privileges. By the time my heart attack occurred, there was a paper trail months long suggesting I was a man about to die. I asked Nathan when Claire first mentioned my health. He said it was about a year ago. She had come home from lunch with Gerald and said she was worried about me, that I seemed tired, that she had heard of a good cardiologist. That was when the appointments were being fabricated. The concern was not spontaneous. It was stagecraft. They were building a narrative my son would believe so that when I died, he would not question it. But here is where the story takes its darkest turn. Marcus had followed the money from the insurance policy further. He discovered that Atlantica Growth Holdings had 10 other key person policies outstanding on founders across 5 states. 4 of those founders had died in the past 3 years. All 4 deaths were certified by Dr. Lawrence Hemphill. All 4 had left behind estates that had been, at least in part, consolidated into Gerald's holdings. One of the deaths had triggered a police inquiry in Alabama that was still open. Marcus had found the case file. The detective on that case had noted, in a memo I now held in my hands, that the pattern of deaths suggested a coordinated fraud, but that the investigation had been stalled due to lack of resources and political pressure from a developer with local influence. Gerald had not tried to kill one man. He had been doing this for years. And my fake death, my 6-month investigation, had pulled a thread that was about to unravel a dozen crimes across half the country. I stepped out of the kitchen and found the prosecutor, a man named Billings, coordinating with the state detective. I handed him Marcus's full report. I told him about the 4 other deaths. I told him about the open case in Alabama. Billings read for a minute, then looked up at me with an expression I have seen on men who realize they are standing on the edge of something much larger than they were prepared for. He said, "Arthur, this is federal. Insurance fraud across state lines, conspiracy to commit murder for financial gain, wire fraud, racketeering. I'm going to need to call the U.S. Attorney's Office." I told him to call whoever he needed. I asked him if the charges would hold. He said with the documentation I had, the witness statements, the paper trail on Hemphill, and the pattern across multiple victims, Gerald Townsend was looking at the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. Claire, depending on what she knew and when she acted, was looking at conspiracy charges, possibly accessory. The doctor was facing license revocation and prison. And the insurance company, once notified, would freeze Gerald's assets faster than he could blink. But there was one more piece, something that had been gnawing at me since I saw Nathan's face in the reception hall. I went back to him. He was still sitting in the folding chair. The pastor had brought him a cup of water. He had not touched it. I sat down beside him. I said, "Nathan, I need you to tell me the truth about what you knew and when you knew it, because the investigators are going to ask, and the only thing I can do to help you is know the truth first." He was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, and he did not stop for a while. He told me that 6 months before I disappeared, Claire had come to him with a plan, not the death plan, a different one. She said Gerald had discovered that I was wealthier than anyone knew. She said Gerald had suggested they approach me about consolidating my assets into a family trust, something that would protect everyone and simplify things. Nathan said he had felt uncomfortable but agreed to let Claire have the conversation. He told me about the dinner where they asked about my estate planning. I remembered it. It was the same dinner where Gerald had asked the name of my attorney. Then Nathan said the conversations changed. Claire stopped talking about a family trust and started talking about my health. She said Gerald had seen my medical records through a contact at the clinic and that there were serious problems I was hiding. Nathan said he had believed her. He had called me and asked me to see a cardiologist. He had not known about the fake appointments. He had thought he was trying to save his father's life. And then, when I disappeared and the death certificate was issued, he had believed I was dead. He had grieved. He had been devastated. But he had also, and this was the part he could barely say, felt a kind of relief, because the estate, under the will Gerald had produced, was finally settled. The tension that had been building for months was over. He could move on. He had not known the will was forged. He had not known about the insurance policy. He had signed documents he did not fully understand because Gerald and Claire had told him they were routine probate filings. He had been, in every sense that mattered, a tool used by his wife and her father to steal millions from a dead man. The dead man who was now sitting next to him in a church fellowship hall, alive and waiting for an answer. I asked him one more question. I asked, "When did you start to suspect?" He said last night. Claire was on the phone with Gerald. I heard her say something I couldn't ignore. She said, "The insurance company is asking questions. We need to move the policy proceeds before the audit." I asked her what policy she was talking about. She told me it was a small one, nothing important, but I couldn't sleep. I went through her desk after she fell asleep. I found a file I wasn't supposed to see. It had the insurance documents. It had the death certificate draft. It had a timeline. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the pages. I didn't know what to do. I was going to come to you today, to the funeral, and tell someone. And then you walked in. I looked at my son. He was 34 years old. He had the same cowlick he had as a boy, the same set of his jaw when he was carrying something heavy. I had spent 6 months wondering if he was my enemy. The answer was worse. He was a victim who had been made into an accomplice without his knowledge, and now he would have to live with that. I told him there would be consequences. The legal ones would depend on what he had signed and whether he could demonstrate he had been deceived. I told him I would pay for his attorney, a separate one from mine, because this was going to be complicated. I told him his marriage to Claire was over in every way that mattered, and the rest was just paperwork. He nodded. He did not argue. He did not defend her. He just sat there with the cup of water in his hands and the weight of everything he had not seen settling onto him. The investigation that followed took 18 months. Gerald Townsend was indicted on 27 federal counts, including wire fraud, mail fraud, identity theft, forgery, conspiracy to commit murder for financial gain, and racketeering. His trial, which began last spring, exposed a criminal enterprise that had operated for over a decade. The 4 other deaths were reopened. 2 of them resulted in additional charges. Dr. Lawrence Hemphill surrendered his medical license and entered a plea agreement that required him to testify against Gerald. He is currently serving 8 years in federal prison. Claire was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and forgery. She accepted a plea deal that included 5 years of probation and full cooperation. Nathan filed for divorce before the ink on her plea agreement was dry. He testified at Gerald's trial. It was not easy for him. It was, he told me later, the hardest thing he had ever done. I told him I was proud of him. I meant it. Gerald was convicted on all counts. The judge, in sentencing, called his scheme one of the most cold-blooded financial crimes this court has ever seen. He received 47 years. At his age, that is a life sentence. The insurance company recovered most of the funds through civil forfeiture. The properties Gerald had acquired through his schemes were liquidated, and the proceeds returned to the estates of the victims. My properties, the ones I had spent decades building, were transferred back to their original trust structures, still intact, still protected. But the resolution is not just about legal outcomes, because there is a question that hung over the 18 months of investigation and trial, a question I asked myself every night when I lay in that small apartment, still technically dead, waiting for my life to be returned to me. The question was not why Gerald did what he did. Greed is not mysterious. The question was why I had created the conditions that made it possible. I had kept my wealth hidden from my own son. I had lived simply because I believed it was virtuous. I had let Linda's old rule, never let them know what you have, turn into a way of cutting myself off from the people who should have been closest. If Nathan had known about the firm, about the insurance policy, about the full scope of what we had built, would he have been so easily manipulated? Would he have recognized the signs earlier? Would Claire and Gerald have been able to isolate him so completely? These are not questions with clean answers, but they are the questions that matter because the money is only ever half the story. The rest is what you do with it, what you hide, what you share, and who you trust along the way. And I had trusted no one, not even my son, and that emptiness was the ground Gerald planted his poison in. 6 months ago, I moved back into my house, the same house where I had argued with the plumber on the morning before everything started, the same kitchen where I had sat in the dark and made the decision to stage my own death. The living room still smells like the same old wood and the same lemon polish Linda used. Nathan comes by on Sundays now. He brings groceries sometimes and we cook together. He is seeing someone new, a woman he met at the courthouse after one of the trial days. She's a court reporter. She has a son from a previous marriage. They came over last week for dinner. The boy asked me if the truck in the garage still runs. I told him it does, and I let him sit in the driver's seat. He asked if I would teach him how to fix things. I said I would. I think about Linda more these days. She would have seen through Gerald in 10 minutes. She would have looked at his jacket and known exactly what he was. And she would have told me to tell Nathan everything years ago, not because of the money, because of the trust that money either builds or breaks. I did not listen to that part of her wisdom. I listened to the part about privacy and missed the part about honesty. It nearly cost me my life. It did cost my son his marriage and 2 years of his sanity. The folder is still in my desk drawer, the one with the insurance policy and the death certificate draft and the text message screenshot. I keep it not to punish anyone, but to remember that evidence is a mirror as much as a weapon, and the man in the reflection had some things to learn. Gerald Townsend is in a federal facility in Georgia now. He has tried twice to appeal his conviction. Both appeals were denied. His lawyers argued that my faked death constituted entrapment. The court disagreed. The court noted that Gerald had begun fabricating my death certificate months before I had any knowledge of his scheme, and that my disappearance was a reasonable response to a credible threat. Stephen framed the ruling and hung it in his office. I have a copy. I have not framed it. I do not need to see it every day to know it happened. The insurance company sent me a letter last month. They wanted to confirm that I was, in fact, alive. I sent them a photograph of myself holding a copy of the day's newspaper. They accepted that as sufficient proof. My life insurance premiums have gone up. I'm told that's standard when you come back from the dead. The letter from the insurance company arrived on a Tuesday. I opened it at the kitchen table, the same table where I had sat in the dark 6 months earlier and decided to become a ghost. The letter confirmed what I already knew. I was officially alive again, reinstated in every database that had declared me dead. But that was not the surprising part. The surprising part was the check. They had refunded 18 months of premiums with interest, a small sum, less than $2,000. And yet that check sat on my kitchen counter for 3 weeks before I could bring myself to cash it. Not because of the amount, because of what it represented. Proof that the system had finally caught up to the truth. The trial took place over 7 weeks in federal court in Atlanta. I attended every day, not out of vengeance. I had stopped feeling the burn of that months ago. I attended because I needed to see the whole machine laid bare. Gerald's defense was that he was a businessman operating in a gray area, that the key person policies were standard practice, that the death certificate draft was just a contingency document for estate planning. His attorneys were expensive and methodical. They tried to paint me as a paranoid old man who had faked his own death and destroyed an innocent family out of spite. They cross-examined me for 3 days. They showed the jury photographs of my modest house, my old car, my ordinary clothes. They argued that a man with real wealth would never live like that unless he was hiding something. They tried to make my frugality look like deception. But then the prosecution called Claire to the stand, and that was the day the defense collapsed. Claire had accepted a plea agreement 2 months before trial began. Her attorney had negotiated for probation in exchange for full cooperation, including testimony against her father. I had not spoken to her since the funeral. Nathan had filed for divorce and moved into a small apartment across town. He was living simply now, working construction again, trying to find his footing. He told me once that he had loved Claire, or thought he had. He said it was hard to separate the woman he married from the woman who helped Gerald plan my death. I told him that was going to take time. Claire walked into the courtroom in a plain gray suit. She did not look at Gerald. She did not look at Nathan. She looked at the prosecutor, and she answered every question with a steadiness that surprised me. She told the jury that Gerald had been running the insurance scheme for over a decade. She told them about the key person policies, the shell companies, the fake medical records. She told them about the night Gerald had explained the plan for me specifically. According to her testimony, Gerald had said that I was his biggest payout yet, the one that would let him retire. He had called me the whale. He had shown her the draft death certificate and asked if she could keep Nathan distracted while the timeline moved forward. She had agreed. She had made the phone call. She had sent the text message. She had helped build the narrative that would make my death look natural. Then the prosecutor asked why she was testifying now. Claire looked at her hands. She said, "Because I found out he was going to let me take the fall." She told the courtroom that in the weeks after my funeral, when the insurance company started asking questions, Gerald had begun shifting blame. He had drafted a letter to prosecutors, never sent, that outlined how Claire and Nathan had orchestrated everything without his knowledge. Claire had found the letter in his office during a visit. She had photographed it. She had realized that her father was preparing to sacrifice her to save himself. That was the moment she went to the FBI. The prosecution projected the photograph of Gerald's draft letter onto the courtroom screen. His handwriting, his signature phrases, his systematic betrayal of his own daughter preserved in black ink. Gerald sat at the defense table and did not move. His expression did not change, but I was watching his hands. They curled slowly into fists. Claire's testimony was followed by Dr. Hemphill, who wore a prison jumpsuit and spoke in a low monotone. He confirmed the fake appointments, the falsified cardiac records, the preparation of a death certificate for a patient he had never met. He said Gerald had threatened to call in the loan on his vacation home if he did not cooperate. He said he had been terrified of Gerald and ashamed of his own complicity. He said there were other files, other deaths, other doctors. He gave the jury a cascade of names. One of those names was a woman named Margaret DeVers, a 74-year-old widow in Alabama whose husband, the founder of a small manufacturing company, had died 4 years earlier. Margaret had spent 3 years fighting the insurance company for benefits that never came, unaware that the policy had already paid out to Gerald's holding company. She had lost her house. She was living with her daughter in a one-bedroom apartment when the FBI contacted her. She came to the trial on the 4th day. She sat in the back row with a cane propped against the bench. During a recess, she found me in the hallway and took my hand. She said, "My husband would have liked you." I asked why. She said, "Because you didn't let them get away with it." I think about Margaret a lot now, because the story of what Gerald Townsend did is not just my story. It is the story of at least 4 other families who did not get their loved one back, who did not get to stand in a church fellowship hall and watch the truth walk through the door. The insurance company eventually settled with the DeVers estate for a sum I am not at liberty to disclose. Margaret was able to buy a small house near her daughter. She sent me a Christmas card last year. She wrote on the inside, "Justice is slow, but it still walks." Gerald was convicted on all counts. The sentencing hearing lasted 2 hours. The judge read a statement that cataloged the full scope of the crimes: $12 million in fraudulent insurance payouts, 4 deaths directly facilitated by falsified medical records, dozens of families defrauded of legitimate benefits, and a conspiracy that stretched across 5 states, and involved at least 6 co-conspirators outside the courtroom. The judge called it a carnival of greed dressed in the language of business. Gerald was sentenced to 47 years. He will be 91 years old when he is eligible for parole. The night after the sentencing, I slept without a dream for the first time in 2 years. But the most surprising detail, the one I have held back until now, concerns something that happened during the trial's 3rd week. A young prosecutor named Elena Marchetti, who had been assigned to the Financial Crimes Unit, called me into a conference room and laid out a document I had never seen. It was a secondary insurance policy, smaller than the key person policy but significant, taken out on my life by a shell corporation registered in Delaware. The beneficiary was not Gerald. The beneficiary was a now-defunct charity that had been run by a former business partner of Linda's. Linda's name was on the incorporation papers. I stared at the document for a long time. The policy had been taken out in 2012, 2 years after Linda's death. Someone had used her identity, her signature, her reputation to build yet another layer of the scheme. The prosecutor told me the charity had been dissolved 3 years ago and its assets routed indirectly back to Gerald. I asked if there was any possibility Linda had known. She said no. The signature was forged. The dates did not align. Linda had been dead for 2 years when the policy was issued. Gerald had used her name, her memory, as a tool to steal from me posthumously. That was the moment I stopped feeling anything toward Gerald except a cold, exhausted pity. He had not even left the dead alone. I walked out of the courthouse that afternoon and called Nathan from the steps. I told him what I had learned. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mom would have hated that." I said, "Yes, she would have. She would have had something specific and pointed to say about it." He laughed, that small laugh I had not heard since he was a teenager. He said, "Probably something about his jacket." I said, "Definitely something about his jacket." Nathan has been rebuilding. It is slow work. He sees a therapist now, a woman recommended by the Victim Services Coordinator at the courthouse. He told me sometime last spring that he was learning to distinguish between guilt and responsibility. Guilt, he said, was the voice that told him he should have known. Responsibility was the voice that told him he could change what came next. He had spent a year drowning in guilt. He was ready for responsibility. A few months ago, he asked me to walk him through everything, not the investigation, the trial, the evidence. He had seen all of that. He wanted to walk through the estate itself, the properties, the trusts, the investments, all the things I had kept hidden for so long. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Linda used to sit across from me with her coffee and her opinions, and I opened the folder. I showed him every property, every asset, every decision I had made and why. I showed him the trust language Linda had insisted on, the ironclad protections she had demanded. I told him about the lean years, the near misses, the deals I had walked away from. I did not hide anything. That was the promise I had made to myself when I decided to come back from the dead. No more secrets, no more gaps for other people to fill. He listened to everything. At the end, he said, "I'm not afraid of it anymore." I asked what he meant. He said, "The money. I was always afraid of it because I didn't know it. Now I know it." He brought his new partner to dinner last month. Her name is Rosa, and she is a court reporter, calm and sharp-eyed, with a laugh that comes easily. She has a 5-year-old son, Matteo, who asks questions about everything, how the toaster works, why the oak tree drops leaves in autumn, whether I have ever been on a boat. I have answered all of them, and I will keep answering them. Nathan looks at Matteo with a patience that is new, a tenderness that comes, I think, from having been through something that taught him what matters. They are not married yet. They may be. I am not rushing anything. I have learned that time reveals what people are, and I have time now. The house feels different. Not renovated, not redecorated, but different in the way a room feels when you open a window that has been painted shut for years. I still drive the same sedan. I still wear the Timex. I still fix my own pipes when they leak. But I have stopped pretending that simplicity is the same thing as invisibility. Being invisible nearly got me killed. Being simple, truly simple, means letting people in, not keeping them out. I keep the folder in my desk drawer still, not the one with Gerald's forged documents. A different folder. This one contains the insurance check, framed now, because a friend told me that the best souvenirs are the ones that remind you of the cost. It contains a letter from Margaret Devers. It contains a photograph of Linda, taken the year we bought this house, standing under the oak tree with her arms crossed and her chin lifted, looking at the camera like she had already figured out the whole future and was just waiting for the rest of us to catch up. And it contains a note from Nathan that he left on my kitchen counter a few weeks after the trial ended. It says, "Dad, thanks for not giving up on me. I'm glad you came back." So am I, because the man who walked into that church 6 months after his own funeral was not the same man who had crawled out from under the kitchen sink 18 months earlier. That man had been hiding for good reasons and bad ones. This man, the one writing these words, has stopped hiding, not from the world and not from himself. I'm often asked now by the few people who know the full story whether I regret the deception, faking my own death, letting my son grieve, letting the funeral unfold while I sat in a rented apartment and waited. It is a fair question. I have thought about it for years. My answer is that regret is not the right word. Regret implies I would make a different choice if given the chance, and I am not sure I would. What I carry instead is something quieter, an awareness of the cost. Every choice I made was necessary, and every choice left a mark. On Nathan, on me, on the version of our relationship that might have existed if I had been braver about the truth earlier. I do not lose sleep over Gerald. I do lose sleep, occasionally, over the 7 months my son believed his father was dead, even if I know with certainty that those 7 months saved his life. There is a statistic I came across during the trial that has stayed with me. According to the FBI, elder financial fraud in the United States costs victims nearly $3 billion annually, but that number only counts reported cases. The real figure is estimated to be much higher because so many victims never come forward. They are embarrassed. They are isolated. They are, in too many cases, dead before anyone notices what was taken. What happened to me was extreme. A fabricated death, a forged will, a conspiracy that touched multiple states and left bodies in its wake. But the mechanics of it, the exploitation of trust, the weaponization of family, the slow isolation of a vulnerable person from the people who might protect them, those mechanics are common. They happen in small towns and big cities, to wealthy people and poor ones, every single day. The only difference between me and the victims who never get justice is that I saw it coming in time. Most people do not. If there is one thing I want you to take from this, it is not that you should hide your money or that you should trust no one. It is the opposite. Secrecy is a vulnerability. The gaps you leave between yourself and the people you love are the places where predators build their nests. I believed I was protecting my son by keeping him in the dark. What I actually did was make him easier to manipulate. Gerald did not have to convince Nathan that I was a bad father. He only had to convince him that I was a simple one. The lie I told by omission made the bigger lies possible. I have spent the years since the trial undoing that, telling Nathan everything, not because he needs the money, but because he deserves the context. The stories behind the properties, the reasons behind the decisions, the full truth of who his father is and who his mother was and what they built together. Linda used to say that money is just a tool like a hammer. You can build a house with it or you can break a window. The difference is the hand holding it. Gerald held it one way, I held it another. But I also kept it locked in a drawer so long that I forgot to teach my son how to hold it at all. That was my mistake, and I have made my peace with it, but I hope you do not have to make the same one. Tell the people you love what they need to know. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. Enough that no one can step into the silence and fill it with lies. Today, the oak tree Linda planted is still standing. The lower branches I kept meaning to trim have finally been cut. Nathan and I did it together last fall. He held the ladder, I worked the saw. Mateo watched from the porch, shouting encouragement. When the last branch came down, Nathan said it looked better. I said Linda would have agreed, and then we went inside and made lunch. If this story has stayed with you, if you know someone who might need to hear it, share it. Subscribe to this channel for more real stories told by the people who lived them. The truth is stranger than fiction, and sometimes the person you underestimate most is the one holding the papers at the back of the room.